The word apocalyptic, which is a big word, has been used a lot in the past few weeks. And mostly these days, that word is used to mean something like catastrophic. But for us in church, it has some other associations. It's a word which comes from the Greek language. It's lifted more or less as it is in the Greek in some ways. And in the Greek of the New Testament, it means something like, it's used obviously in different ways in different places, but it means something like to uncover or to reveal. There's something of the sense of pulling back a curtain or unveiling something to let us see what's behind it. And over the years, it came to be used of a kind of writing which we find in different places in the Bible, often prophetic writing. And what this writing tries to do is to set particular events of human history, things that we see happening, to set them in the context of the story we tell about the whole of human life and human history. The very last book in the Bible, the book of Revelation, is sometimes called simply the Apocalypse. John of Patmos there sees a vision in which the curtain between heaven and earth is drawn back. And the first century Christians that he's writing to, who are being martyred by the Roman Empire, they are shown a vision of heaven in which Jesus, the Lamb who was slain, is on the throne and has won a decisive victory through his death. So in the Bible, when we have apocalyptic writing, it's helping us to understand the big picture, if you like, the biggest picture of all. Where is history headed? Who is in charge? Who will have the last word? And it often uses heightened language, visions of monsters and beasts, as in the book of Revelation, mysterious symbols and numbers. The number of perfection, 7, the big number which falls short of perfection, 666. This is all part of apocalyptic writing. And it has something in common with things that we find if you're a fan of science fiction or fantasy writing today. Some of the same techniques and ideas are at work there. We find apocalyptic writing in the Old Testament, in the book of Daniel, in the visions of Ezekiel. We find it in the book of Revelation, and we also find it in little pockets within the Gospels, which brings us to today's Gospel reading. The reading set for today on Remembrance Sunday, a passage from Mark 13, and it's sometimes called the Little Apocalypse. And it's a reading which does something which we often find in apocalyptic writing. It unsettles us, it warns us, and then it points us towards hope. And I want to think with you about those things. It unsettles us because we hear the disciples saying to Jesus, they're saying, Jesus, look at the temple. Look at how impressive it is. Look at how enormous it is. Look at the size of these stones that people have hauled here to build it. And far from being impressed, Jesus says, even this is not going to last. One day this will be torn down and these stones will be scattered. And perhaps they shouldn't have been surprised, because in Israel's history, the first temple, Solomon's temple, it had already been torn down once by the invading armies from Babylon and Assyria. It had been burned and the people had been taken from Jerusalem into exile. And in the book of Daniel, well, Daniel's visions were of empires which rose and then which fell. Empires which were so powerful in their day that they seemed impossible to stand against or to resist. But as time went on, Israel had drawn on Daniel's visions to see these empires in a bigger picture. The Babylonians had risen and fallen. The Assyrians had risen and fallen. After the time of Daniel, people applied it to the Greeks, Alexander the Great and that empire. And now in Jesus' time, of course, the Roman Empire, the daddy of them all, at least maybe until the 19th century. And just as empires had come and gone, the second temple, rebuilt after the exiles came back, well, Jesus said this second temple, it's not going to last either. When we read our history books, we find that after the time of Jesus, well, the temple was indeed destroyed. But then the empire which destroyed it, it was itself destroyed, the Roman Empire. It had built buildings much bigger than the Jerusalem temple, but it too as an empire was destroyed and torn down. And on every continent in every century we can trace something similar, not least among them the British Empire, built on the obscene profits of the Atlantic slave trade, which colonized huge tracts of the global south, so that people boasted the sun never set on the British Empire, but it too was broken up and scattered. And perhaps this weekend we should also say the corporate headquarters of the fossil fuel companies and their multinational empires, they too will not last forever, even though their power still seems painfully strong after what happened last night. And the power of those who watered down the COP declaration last night, it will not last forever either in its current form. So today, Jesus unsettles us. His words resonate with judgment and with hope, because even the biggest stones and the grandest buildings and the greatest powers in history are not going to last forever. His words humble those who build empires, and they give hope to those who are ruled by empires. And let's add quickly, they also humble churches, don't they? Because this was the temple they were talking about, a religious building, and we've seen in Europe the power and the status of the churches be reduced, and of our own kirk here in Scotland. We've seen it go from a position of almost dominance in Scottish life to one in which it's weaker and weaker. In our gospel reading, Jesus then sits down on the hill opposite the temple, and 4 of the disciples come and they ask him privately. It's as if they're looking for a secret revelation, a private apocalypse. When is this going to happen, Jesus? And what are the signs going to be of it happening? And Jesus gives them another warning, which is also common in apocalyptic writing. Beware, he says, that no one leads you astray. You see, down through history, there have been people, including people within the churches and so-called Christian people, who have acted as false prophets, who've claimed to know the secrets of history. Just a few weeks ago, hundreds of people gathered in the USA, people who are part of a dangerous and delusional cult called QAnon. They waited in their hundreds to see if JFK Jr. Would come back from the dead. It's a really bizarre story, and it's linked to being reincarnated as one of the Rolling Stones. You could not make this stuff up. But we live in strange times. Facebook and other social media networks help to spread bizarre conspiracy theories. Anti-vaxxers come to believe that the COVID vaccines, which by the grace of God have been made available to us, contain tiny computer chips and can magnetize your body. Many of the same folks believe 5G phone masts are spreading COVID. Others believe the Holocaust never happened. Others believe global warming is all a hoax. And often the followers of these false ideas overlap with one another and they reinforce one another. And often they're also linked to racist and to anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish beliefs. So behind this is Jewish money and George Soros and all of these things. And Jesus says, beware of people who come and lead you astray. We need to have a critical intelligence within the church, and we need to listen to one another and talk to one another. And if we hear things or read things on the internet, let's bring them into the church and say, what do you think? I'm not sure. This was confusing for me. Because many of us may know somebody who's an anti-vaxxer who's swallowed some of these dangerous and delusional ideas. And so we need to be a community who can help one another. Beware of those who claim to have secret knowledge, because what they're peddling is the opposite of apocalyptic. Their work conceals instead of reveals, and it brings darkness instead of light. So Jesus unsettles us and warns us that not everything that seems permanent and powerful in history is going to last. And Jesus warns us to beware of those who may lead us astray. And finally, in our gospel reading, he says something which has particular resonance for us today on Remembrance Sunday, and which is not necessarily an easy thing for us to hear. These are very famous words. Jesus says, when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, nation rising against nation and kingdom rising against kingdom, and earthquakes and famines. And you see, these words take us into very difficult territory for us as Christians when we are confronted by suffering and tragedy in human history, including the unspeakable tragedy of war and the horror and the suffering it brings to people. How do we as Christians make sense of this? How do we read the signs of the times? How do we keep faith when things in the world around us begin to fall apart? And the first thing I want to say as a theologian and as a minister and as a believer is that there are no good answers to these questions. I want to hold my hands up and say, I don't have any good answers to the problem of suffering. And I don't think actually the church or Christian theology does either. I think there should be a week in the Alpha course or in our church membership class when we say, oh, and by the way, if you're thinking of becoming a Christian and following Jesus, you should price this in, that you're always going to be troubled by the problem of suffering, and that there are no easy ways to hold that. But here's the thing. Before you then say, okay, well, I'm going to pack my bags and leave the church and give up on Christianity altogether, nobody else in the world has a good answer to that either. So it's not a choice between Christianity struggling to deal with the question of suffering and other people having a great answer to it. Nobody has a good answer to the problem of suffering. And what we may feel and find if we are Christian people is that Christianity, with its long history of lament and of spiritual and theological struggle with these questions, Christianity which has as its central symbol the cross of Christ, in which God comes among us and shares in the suffering of the world mysteriously but powerfully, God in solidarity with a suffering world. Christianity may offer us a map, a compass, and a hope of navigating our way through the darkest moments and experiences of our life. And we may still struggle. But I suppose my testimony would be, for me, it's the best map. It's the best compass. It's the best hope. It's the most light that I have found. And in this little apocalypse in our gospel reading, Jesus says two things which I want to finish with this morning. The first is, Jesus says that war is not going to be the last word in human history. So we may look at what's going on around us, and in the middle of a war particularly, we may feel that. But somehow one of the things that our faith does call us to believe is that in the sweep of human history, we may not understand why God allows these things to happen, but we do not believe that history is hopeless. And Jesus says the last word in history is not violence, is not war, is not suffering, is not pain. And he also talks about, and this is not an easy image, I don't think, he talks about the fact that these perhaps could be understood as birth pangs. That sometimes when the only sounds we can hear are sounds of pain, we should not give up on the fact that there is new life on the other side of this. And so the last word in human history is not war, is not violence. I have real doubts whether you should ever apply that image to anyone's particular pain. But in this biggest of pictures, which we call apocalyptic, I think it's an image which calls us to hope. Because in our gospel today, we hear Jesus saying the last word is not war. It's not hatred. It's not power. It's not violence. It's not greed. The last word and the eternal word is life. Thanks be to God. Amen.